Here we are again for another NZ Aviation Podcast using this wonderful Zoom application. Paul Brennan here in the bunker in Auckland, and Martin, looks like you're basically the same location as last time.
Yeah, sitting in a park in the outskirts of Roma. Yeah, on a cloudy and cool morning.
People are driving past. I haven't heard a car thinking, what's he doing there, sitting, talking into his phone?
Yeah, well, the internet's pretty patchy here, so you do find people sitting all over the place in odd places hooking into the internet.
Big thing to mention at the start of this podcast is that we mentioned in the last podcast a week and a bit ago that we were encouraging people to support us on Patreon, not only us, but the Bring Our Birds Home campaign through the Bring Our Birds Home Patreon page. We have our first patron, Martin.
Now, how cool is that? That's very good. Thank
you.
So
I reckon that that's a bit of a breakthrough, and you know, if people support us in this way, we can do this more regularly because we've got busy lives and we've got jobs and we've got money to earn. So taking time out to do this has a little bit of an impact, and if we can be helped along, it's nice. So thank you to that patron, a great milestone. So thank you to that person, and only a few dollars a month would be appreciated. So let's see where we can go there. Plenty to talk about. I don't know where we are on COVID-19 and lockdown rules. We're starting to ease things up. The bars have been opened. The group size is expanding to 100, I think, in the next few days. They're saying that we're going to stay at this level probably for the next 4 weeks. Thousands of people a day are losing their jobs. The opposition National Party has changed its leadership, and they're fighting talk there for this election coming up. Winston Peters of New Zealand First is starting to show signs of being a little frustrated at the pace of opening things up again. And the National Party new leader, Todd Muller, is not really putting too much cold water on a possible chat maybe later with Winston. So things are changing here. I see in Australia, the Queensland government's come in for some big criticism over their belts and road initiative with China, and that's getting people worried. So that's something.
That was the Victorian government, the People's Republic of Victoria, Daniel Andrews. Yeah, he signed the Belt and Roads Agreement without telling the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Now, why would you do that?
Because it's Victoria.
Okay.
It really is the People's Republic of Victoria. That's a lot of people are saying that now. It's very strange, and in the states in general, Queensland probably in particular, there's an awful lot of posturing going on with this whole COVID opening up thing because it's coming down to political point scoring now. Any Labour-led state will not do what the federal government asks them because of the whole Labour-Liberal split, and it's just I think it's turning into a bit of a farce. But hey, there you go. That's politics for you, eh?
Why would you trust the Chinese Communist Party over and above your own federal government?
Well, because again, it's the People's Republic of Victoria.
What do Victorians think about it, though? Because usually, quite often there can be a disconnect between the government and what the people think.
Well, and this is exactly what's being discussed. Peter Credlin, Tony Abbott's ex-advisor, she was on Sky News. Now, Sky News, a bit polarizing sometimes, but she was going on about exactly that, about how she was talking about the Australian version of the deep state, and her whole point was, and she's had a whole lot of clips, selectively edited probably, but where she's got senior bureaucrats on camera personally bemoaning things like trade and climate change and all this type of thing. And as she keeps pointing out, she says this is exactly what the people don't want, and yet the government tries to start an initiative to do something, and the senior bureaucrats, which are, I don't want to get into the whole left-right thing, but the senior bureaucrats tend to be more left of centre than certainly the Liberals. And they just don't do it. They slow it down, they don't do it, they bog it down, or in the case of Victoria, they go off and sign an agreement with the Chinese Communist Party.
I mean, this is a pattern that seems to be emerging across the Western world. this whole, this talk of this thing called deep state. Now, I don't know if this really exists or whatever, but that permanent public service class that they see governments come and go, and have kind of decided for themselves that they run the show. One could probably argue that this is maybe one of the single biggest threats to our democratic system.
Well, it's exactly like that old, you remember that old British comedy, Yes, Minister?
Yeah.
It's exactly like that. I mean, these guys do run the show, and as people point out, they're all on $600,000 to $900,000 a year, and they are very powerful, and they control the bureaucracy. So anything you want to get done's got to go through them, and it's a problem, but it's a problem. I don't know what you do about it, because that's how the whole thing is set up.
It's interesting how it lays down to, if you look in the United States and sort of scrape the surface a bit, you realize that all these people are interconnected. The people who run the mainstream media television networks, for example, are husbands and partners of political people, or vice versa. These roots go down real deep. I don't think anyone quite realized that at the time. So affecting any sort of change, if you're running against that sort of mindset, is kind of nigh on impossible at the moment. And if you do push it, you're demonized. So I just wonder, where that leaves a country like Australia, and where it leaves a country possibly like New Zealand, because in terms of China, I imagine that pretty well Australia and New Zealand are the same pattern of play for the Chinese. Probably not too much difference between the way they sort of interface with Australian government, albeit its federal system, and the New Zealand government. We don't hear too much about that here, but I guess for the Chinese, they've worked out who the movers and shakers and the
absolutely
in the public service class are. They've wined them, dined them, made them feel good, and have got them on side potentially.
Well, they consider, I mean, the Chinese government has said it, they consider Australia and New Zealand to be client states. Wow. And I think that says it all. There you go. They expect Australia and New Zealand to do pretty much what they want.
And I believe it's against the law for Chinese nationals abroad to refuse to cooperate with their intelligence services. I think that was a law passed a couple of years ago. Now, people can research that. I'm pretty sure that's accurate. So, we don't have those things binding us to our government. How do we know what's going on? How do we know that we are secure? I mean, how much can we trust our security services if the public servants that run them are in this mindset?
I think we have to accept that as far as China's concerned, when you're not secure. The Chinese have spent decades making sure that their people are all over the place. I don't want to say there's a conspiracy or something, but you are right. I think the Chinese consider, their whole citizenship systems, it's race-based. You're Chinese, and you're always Chinese. You might have a Malaysian passport, you might have a Singaporean passport, but as far as the Chinese government are concerned, you are Chinese. If you come into China, you'll be treated like all the rest of the Chinese. And if you're a Chinese citizen and you go overseas, and the Chinese government, I don't think they expect them actively to do a lot, but the Chinese are very, they are Chinese, and I think to be Chinese means it's different to them, to those people, than it is to say I'm a Kiwi. I'm a Kiwi. I might be patriotic, but I'm not going to blindly follow whatever New Zealand says. Now, I don't think that all the Chinese blindly follow exactly what China says, but I think it's degrees. You don't need much to have more influence over people than perhaps another system of government has. And China's always been like that. I mean, their whole system's always been about centralizing power and managing things rather than providing an environment where people can kind of get on with it and do their own thing. They are how do you say, compulsive managers of people and resources. And I don't think anybody should be surprised. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's the way it is. that's just how they operate. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's probably not a great thing for countries like Australia, New Zealand, the USA that value individualism, because they're fundamentally encouraged not to be individualistic, and are generally expected to be open to suggestions from the mothership.
Yeah,
which
well,
sounds terrible, but
if they're called upon in another country, they are bound to listen, and en masse. I mean, we saw in Australia that huge buy-up of PPE gear. Now, that was a coordinated buy-up involving
well,
thousands of remote shoppers. How does that happen?
I wouldn't say they're bound to comply. I just think
no, it's illegal not to. It's against
but
the
I also
law.
just think that I just think they're more likely to comply than not. Whereas we'd say get stuffed.
Yeah.
We naturally would. Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing, and it's a classic example of sort of white anting yourself, and it's going to be very interesting to see how people dig out of it. And of course, as the Chinese people get more and more aware of how they are being treated by their own government, the central government is probably going to get more and more controlling, because they're worried that it's going to get out of control and they're going to lose control, and then it's all over.
Well, look what's happening in Hong Kong now. Taiwan, I think, are a little nervous. Our Prime Minister, I think, was quoted as saying the other day that any inquiry or looking into where this virus came from shouldn't have any blame attached to it. I don't see why you can't blame an entity if they're responsible for laying this on the world and destroying our economies. There seemed to be pretty good evidence. I see a Australian Sky TV feature a few days ago had quite an interesting evidence trail leading it back to a created coronavirus. Apparently it adheres to human cells like nothing else, and there's been research going on there. That may or may not be true, but there seems to be a huge reluctance to even contemplate that, and that's interesting in of itself.
If you're a client state, you don't want to upset your master, do you? Because they'll, as you're seeing in Australia, they'll stop buying your barley and they'll start putting import controls.
Well, they've already destroyed our economy, so.
Well, I think the Chinese might quite fairly argue, no, you destroyed your economy yourself.
Well, yeah, well, actually, very good point. Yeah, we did by overreacting, clearly. But anyway, it's an interesting situation.
The level of central control is actually very interesting. To bring this back to an airliner or an aircraft angle, Cathay Pacific consists of Dragon Air, and I think they've got another low-cost airline. I forget what it's called. Anyway, there's 3 airlines in the Cathay Pacific group. And as part of their COVID response, they're obviously going to get a lot smaller. And what they want to do is they want to combine all these airlines they want to restructure. And Singapore's doing the same thing. And I guess what they're going to do is they're going to combine their low cost and their regular cost. And they're going to try and get some of the savings they've got for the low cost airline and apply that across the whole group. Now, Cathay Pacific's been told by the Chinese government they're not allowed to restructure. And they've got Cathay Pacific only flies, I think, to 2 or 3 cities in China, but Dragon Air, their sort of regional subsidiary, flies to sort of 60 cities within China. And the Chinese government has said, no, if you restructure, you won't be able to apply those routes to the general Cathay Pacific group. And the reason the Chinese government is giving is because some of the Cathay Pacific employees were apparently taking part in the Hong Kong protests. And so what China's done is they put a sort of a red mark against any application Cathay Pacific makes to make any changes. And that red mark stays on for a year. And I think they're up to 3 now. And that shows you the level of control they have. Oh no, we think some of your employees protested in the Hong Kong protests, which they probably did, and they have every right to. And so the Chinese government says, no, you can't restructure now. That's it.
Yeah, well, good luck to Cathay Pacific then. And I would imagine, given the current circumstances, keeping it now moving it into aviation, Chinese won't be very motivated to buy American airliners. No,
I think that's a definite, yeah. And also, I think Cathay Pacific was a 777X. I think they were on the list for some of those. They won't be buying any of those. That's, bringing it back into aircraft, that's very interesting because Scoot, Silk Air in Singapore's restructuring, combining everything. Norwegian looks like Norwegian's finally going bankrupt. Delta's not taking excess A350s that LATAM and South America bought. And I was reading an article yesterday that's saying, Scoot, for example, has a lot of, and Norwegian, they have a lot of 787s. They reckon the market's going to be flooded with 787s, secondhand 787s. And that could have a big effect on Boeing's order book going forward, because some of these things are going to be less than a year old. That's
Wow, it's just such a different world compared to only months ago. It's incredible what's happened. Let's pick up on some of the big news of the last week. The Pakistan Airlines Flight 8303 crash at Karachi. Oh my God, you start digging into this and you wonder what planet that captain was on. The most unstable descent and approach to that airport you could ever imagine. Absolutely no sign in the radio comms of any problems. No, we're confident we can handle this. I think they're at 10,000 feet at only about 6 miles from the threshold, which, as every pilot knows, is so high for that late stage in the approach. Looks like that they were descending at a rate of 7,000 feet a minute at one stage to get to the right point on the glide slope, very close in. It seems that they put the gear down to try and slow down because they're above the gear stress limit of 260 knots, I've read, and because they were descending so steeply, they couldn't keep the speed down. Apparently, some have said that you've got to cycle the gear again to get it down if it doesn't come down due to overspeed. They didn't do that. They left the gear up. They obviously thought it was down, landed on the engines, destroyed the oil feeds, which are under the CFM engines, which, of course, they went around, miraculously got off the runway again. The engines gave power for a short time, and then you can hear in the ATC comms the stress coming into presumably the captain or one of the flight crew's voice. And Mayday, 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 engines shut down, and they just drifted down into a suburb of Karachi near the airport. Just an incredible bungle, and you can see that there wasn't a gear problem initially because they had the gear down after they went around. 97 people killed, a couple survived. Miraculously, no one killed on the ground. But I mean, it brings into a whole lot of questions. The training that's supplied. Also, it's a lesson in assertiveness, co-pilot assertiveness. I mean, if you're a co-pilot and you see this happening, you've got to take over, right? You've got to say, "Hey, I'm in command now. Get out of the way." But of course, that didn't happen. And look what happened.
It'll be interesting to look into the background of the pilots, because
military
co-pilot. Yeah, well, exactly, and that's where co-pilot assertiveness often doesn't cut through, because if your captain's an ex-squadron leader and you were an ex-flight lieutenant, you're hardly going to tell your squadron, someone who was more senior to you for a great part of your life, that he doesn't know what he's doing and you're taking over, when it was seemingly obvious that whoever was flying that aircraft didn't know what they were doing.
Well, I mean, they must have known what they were doing to a certain extent. Presumably, I looked at the hours on the crew. The captain had many hours on A320s, but it's just that one thing where, for a start, how do you arrive at the start of an ILS nearly 8,000 feet higher than you should be? How does that happen? And then how do you think you can create a stabilized approach when you're coming down from that height? I mean, you've got to have everything done and dusted 1,000 feet stabilized, or you're going around. And all that was thrown out the window. It was just
you revert to training, and so he probably reverted back to his days as a F-16 pilot. I'll bring this baby home, don't you worry.
Yeah, well, we don't know if it was military. It's quite possible. Of course, Korea, I think, South Korea had that problem, didn't they, in the early 80s through the 80s, where they had that culture of seniority in the civil realm. They sort of exported from the military, and that resulted in some pretty bad crashes because of the breakdown in the crew sort of loop. But I don't think the investigators are going to have to work too hard to find out why this one happened. But it was just so meaningless. I mean, it should not have happened. And of course, always there are cameras operating. You can see the footage of the thing with a very high angle nose up, coming down with obviously no engine power. gears out into that suburb. So
Mm.
that was a shocker, man. That was a shocker.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yes, you do wonder how that. I mean, it'll always happen, but it is always surprising when that amount of that many errors creep into something which should have been easily avoided.
Well, in the comms, you can actually hear the gear warning alert ringing in the background.
Mm.
But I guess you get overloaded when,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. Stop hearing.
Well, remember that 737. What was it? Helios Airlines that depressurized, and they all went unconscious, and it flew into a hill near Athens, I think, some years ago. All the appropriate warnings, albeit slightly confusing if they were coming at once. I think the point was made, but all the warnings were going there, and still didn't figure out what was going on.
Well, that's actually quite interesting. That I don't know if you saw it, but Calhoun, the new head of Boeing, he put out an interview. I think it was over the weekend, which I read. Whereas he said Boeing is going to have to fundamentally rethink the flight controls of their new single aisle or new middle of the market aircraft that they're coming out with, because the current batch of pilots, or the current generation of pilots, which is coming up and coming, is not going to be easily trainable to handle the flight control system such that the 737 MAX has, a largely manual system. And it's all about it's less about, Boeing have been quite proud of the fact that flying a 737 and their philosophy has always been about flying the aircraft, less about managing the aircraft, which is basically Airbus's philosophy. And Boeing have admitted they're going to have to change, and they're going to have to change the way they handle errors, and they're going to have to change the way they notify pilots of problems, because they obviously saying that the 737 MAX accidents were avoidable had the pilots been flying according to the Boeing philosophy, despite
Right.
the fact they were probably getting erroneous warnings and this type of thing. It still should have been quite obvious how to fly that aircraft. It's not just Boeing, it's also Airbus. You remember that accident where the Air France plane went down over the South Atlantic, right?
The 330, yeah.
The A330, yeah. And that was probably training it was the reverse case. They forgot to fly the airplane, despite the plane was telling them exactly what was wrong. There were issues, but if they'd looked out of the window and actually flown the aircraft, or done some quick calculations in their head, there's no reason that plane should have spiraled into the South Atlantic like it did, but they just lost control.
To be fair, the senior pilot wasn't in the flight deck at that stage,
Right.
was it? It was
He
a
had to come
junior
back in, didn't he?
relief pilots, and I think they went in with full deflection elevator up all the way down. Yeah,
terrible. Anyway, yeah, these things can happen even despite whatever system you're using. If you just don't, you're not in the moment, it gets away from you. Terrible.
Can you imagine what it was like back in, say, the late 50s, early 60s, flying a 707 with only rudder boost available to you down an ILS manually?
After coming off a DC-7 or something, a prop liner. Yeah, it would have been quite different, eh?
Well, I am more trusting of those skills, actually.
Yeah, but now they're just not there.
No. Well, it makes no sense to operate an airliner in that way. But in terms of the Boeing philosophy, you make a good point. And that maybe explains what people described as Boeing's possible arrogance after those MAX crashes, where they seem to be quite unsympathetic. But that's probably because they thought, well, if you're flying the plane like our ethos says, then you wouldn't have had a problem, you dummies.
Pretty much, yeah. Pretty much.
Yeah.
But now they've admitted they're going to have to change their whole control philosophy, and it's probably going to look a lot more like Airbus.
Which tells you the strength of Airbus. By the way, in the background, I've got a picture that says Keropunk.
Mm-hmm.
I've decided to invent a new category: steampunk, Keropunk. Watch out for the T-shirts, the caps, the mugs, everything. Watch out for it. The web pages, I'm going to get right into it. That's a little picture I got displayed in the background there. Speaking of old jets versus new jets. Well, here in New Zealand, they've resumed more domestic flying in the last few days. Air New Zealand is saying that they're really going to gear their schedule for business people to get the economy going again. And they're offering flights to the major provincial centres from same-day flights from the 3 or 4 main domestic destinations, you know, the obvious ones, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin. So that's coming back. They've laid off some senior management, including the director of marketing. Why would you let the director of marketing go?
Yeah, it's interesting. The director of marketing, and I think there was a customer engagement person. Yeah, well, maybe they reckon they're going to during a downsize for the next 2-3 years, they're not going to be marketing anything.
Or maybe they're not happy with
simple.
They're not happy with the image, because we've talked about this a lot. The image that Air New Zealand's had recently has been of overpriced, kind of adolescent branding, and you know, not really engaged, even using the Kiwi thing, but not being, you know, very good to its, you know, its Kiwi market and shareholders, because you know, we all basically own 52% of that airline. Maybe it says more about the standard of marketing.
Possibly, and I would like to think that is the case, because I think, and this is just me, but I think that Air New Zealand marketing over the last 4 or 5 years has been geared to appealing to a sort of snooty part of New Zealand. It's all sort of fancy and tries to be a bit slick. But the whole point of New Zealand is that it's good, honest, really good, but not necessarily slick, not appealing to what the Aussies would call the top end of town, because sort of the New Zealand myth is that there isn't really a top end of town. We're all in this together.
Egalitarian.
And I think egalitarian, exactly. And I don't think that's a bad image. And I think it's an image that Air New Zealand wasn't pushing. It was all rather, you know, you'd watch the in-flight promos and everything, and they were like, well, what is this?
Well, like I said, they were adolescent. They're like teenagers were in charge of the whole thing.
Yeah, and this whole thing about doing the in-flight videos and trying to get YouTube likes and all this type of thing. It was, it didn't sit well with me. It didn't sit well with me at all.
No. Yeah, and also
so maybe that's why. Maybe you're right.
New CEO is steeped in retail. He's from Walmart. And you've got to know your market really well if you're in retail, especially big retail, and Walmart is as big as it gets. He might have, I'm not trying to second guess, who knows, but he might have realized, hey, you guys have lost the plot, actually. We need to go back to some
if that's the reason, good on him, because I would agree with that. I did think that in recently getting into an Air New Zealand jet, it was like walking into a branch of Westpac or ANZ. Just everything was corporate, slick, not Kiwi, at all.
And overpriced, always.
And massively overpriced. Well, just like a retail bank, overpriced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They say that it'll be up to 2, maybe 2.5 years before they're back to even 70% of their operation. I guess they've shrunk it down. Government's provided them a lifeline of cash if they need it. It's going to be a smaller operation, but I just wonder how profitable you can be in that situation.
I think that's overly pessimistic. And one thing New Zealand's going to need to get going is cheap flights bringing as many people as possible to New Zealand. And I do think that's overly pessimistic. I understand they're going to have to downsize, but their target should be to be at 110% capacity in 10 months. Because you're going to have to accept that this whole coronavirus thing, even if it's still out there, it's going to blow over because people are just getting sick of it.
Well, it's interesting, actually, because I'm in the media, I hear a lot of different views, just, almost by osmosis. I'm sort of in that zone. And, there are some people who are lamenting the passing of this sort of lockdown. The Stockholm Syndrome sufferers kind of quite liked it.
Yeah. And New Zealand, everywhere needs to bounce back, and they will bounce back. Obviously, I also hope that there are major changes to the way things are done. And this is an opportunity to make those changes. I doubt that any meaningful change will be made in the short term. But, in terms of Air New Zealand, they can't talk themselves down like this. They've got to come up with a plan to get big quick, and start bringing people in. And sooner or later, once the polling numbers indicate that the people are sick and tired of it, the government will open right up, quick as a flash. It'll all be over.
And then you'll be asking, well, why do we do this?
Well, that's the next stage. Yes, I mean that's happening in England at the moment, and it's very interesting. You read the English papers, and whoa, you think, geez, it's going to be it's going to be ugly. Anyway, that's that.
I've been watching that the whole reaction to that guy Dominic, what's his name, who
Cummings,
that's right, and you know, he went and took his kids to his parents' place and all that sort of stuff. Apparently under, you know, regulations that sort of allowed you in special circumstances, if you had kids, to make plans. But the interesting thing was, and this is where, you know, you've really got to put the filter on, when the media were hounding him for you know, lack of social distancing, and they pulled back on the shot, and all the media were within millimeters of each other in a pack.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, you've got to practice what you preach if you really want to be truly virtuous. These people have no virtue.
No, it's funny, and it's I mean, it's a sad story here, but I thought it was kind of ironic. There's a murder case here in Queensland, and they've got very strict, very strict border controls here. You can't cross the border unless, of course, you're a nurse flying up from Sydney to work in Rockhampton with symptoms of COVID. That's all right. You can go and work in the hospital.
Oh no, there are plenty of exceptions, and I'm sure the elites get around if they have to.
Well, this guy wasn't an elite. He unfortunately murdered his parents and hit the road, and it was in Sydney. 14 hours later, he drove down to Sydney, and people are saying, "Well, how the hell did you get to Sydney? There's a border control."
Can't be very good.
No,
Dad's army.
Jeez, you just anyway. Yeah, so I haven't heard much more about the Virgin thing. That seems to have gone a bit quiet. I don't.
Well, their flights have resumed. I see some flights have resumed.
Some flights have picked up again. The administrators are trying to get the airline operating again. They're still asking for a government bailout. I expect the offers that came in were all lowball, and now they're thinking,
Of course they would be.
Of course they would be. Of course they would be. It wasn't a going concern, and it has no assets. So I don't know what the hell they were expecting. But anyway. So I'm waiting to see what happens with that.
And the unions are not budging. The unions are not budging. I saw a story on any of the pay and conditions of any of the employees. This is typical Australian. I mean, they will have to budge at some point because
we know how that works, don't we? Yeah, they'll get fired.
Yeah, but I mean, why do they keep on throwing them? What's the definition of madness? Doing the same thing, expecting a different outcome. They always, you can predict this with Australian unions. Always.
Well, the only alternative is to be flexible and enter into negotiation and with an outcome that you might not like. So why not just commit suicide, throw yourself against the wall? Because at least you've made a stand for your people. And you've done your best, and you can consider how well you've done when you go home and count your $300,000-$400,000 salary while 10,000 people have just been fired.
That's right. It's interesting. Yeah. Speaking of big salaries, a lot of the local governments here are starting to say, "Well, hey, we're X amount down on revenue." I think the Auckland City Council is saying we're going to be $500 million down on revenue. Not one of their massively overpaid, probably only work a couple of hours a day, in truth, employees have even offered to take any sort of pay cut.
Yeah, you wonder how a city of 1.4 million people can get $500 million down so quickly. And you look at these budgets, and it's not just Auckland, you look at these budgets and you just think, oh my God, there's not that many people to pay for all this garbage. And the only way they can pay for it is by clipping everybody's ticket all the bloody time. I mean, it's and don't get me started on the shopping malls with runways that have become the airports, because that's exactly what happens there too. Anyway.
Well, the Auckland City Council, I think last week said, well, this means that we'll have to stop events and all that sort of stuff. And I thought, I see how it works. So you have all these events that you do, and you have your little pools of associated friend networks that run all these things. And that's how it works. it's incredible that events and stuff that's ancillary to the core business of sewage and rubbish collection, all that, seem to they're spending a hell of a lot on these things. And surely that's another argument for local bodies getting back to core business and limiting their budgets substantially to that. So you can see how it's sort of grown out beyond that over a long period of time. And I mean, if we're talking about $500 million in non-core expenditure that has to be dropped, then you really wonder what they're spending their money on. But anyway, I don't know enough, but that's the way it came across to me. But we certainly know that many people in that organization, the Auckland Council, but it'll be repeated all around the country at the various scales, are paid massively more than average Kiwis. And it's been going on for a long time. It's been exposed, but really people don't seem to be that bothered with it. There's no great call for limiting or capping these exorbitant salaries. And of course, they all just rotate around the organizations. They're in the system, they rotate around, and they do very well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and maybe that's one of the changes that will come of this. And I do find it interesting that you say that Air New Zealand's opening up, concentrating on business carriers, because business passengers, because I guarantee you a great deal of those business passengers will be state officials and city government officials flying around the country for the next catch up and everything, because most businesses can't afford to send people anywhere anymore.
Well, imagine if you're used to traveling every week and you're used to stuffing yourself to the max in the Koru Club, and you're denied that for a couple of months. It'd be like a junkie with no drugs.
Yeah. yeah. It's yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So
that's Air New Zealand's plan, right? And we've gone through Australia. There's not a lot going on in Australia. Where are we going to now?
Well, let's talk about some of the carriers in trouble. I see LATAM is going for bankruptcy protection. I thought I heard in the US, they're not headquartered, or their business isn't US centric, is it? It's I thought it was a mixture of well, I think the substantial shareholder is a Brazilian family, but obviously they got operations in Chile as well. They got cash till September, I saw reported, but after that it gets it becomes a problem. They're a big operator, LATAM. I've flown them. They're a great carrier. They're reliable, a good service, and they've got a pretty great network. And when we wanted to go to Brazil and further the Bring Our Birds Home effort with the DC-8, do you think Air New Zealand was interested in helping us? No. Was LATAM? Yeah, they gave us free domestic flights for 4 people.
Well, that's nice. That's very nice.
So
yes,
I like LATAM, but they seem to be in trouble. And you mentioned that they had excess A350s coming that Delta wouldn't take. I think Delta's a shareholder. So
the Delta's not taking them.
Norwegian. So there are a few carriers,
Yeah. Oh, a lot of carriers. I mean, Lufthansa is taking $10 billion from the German government. Air France and KLM, there's rumors again that they're going to split, which would be basically a death knell for Air France. The government would have to take them over, because that was always a very strange pairing. You had Air France took over KLM, but KLM should have actually taken over Air France and sorted them out. Yeah.
It was like McDonnell Douglas taking over Boeing. It was wrong.
It was kind of crazy, yeah. So there's talk of that splitting up again. Norwegian is finally actually contemplating entering proper bankruptcy proceedings. That's Virgin. Yeah, it does fascinate me, because these airlines, I don't know whether they're posturing to get a position for when they're suddenly required and they can put their hands out, or they really are thinking there's going to be a massive downturn in the industry for the next 4 or 5 years, and that some of them really aren't going to survive. I don't know.
Surely this is the time, though, for that sort of magical, high capacity, very cheap to fly, international, low cost carrier with A380s and 800 seats.
You think that this might be the opportunity, get the world moving again? It's going to take a while for people to want the world to get moving again, because a lot of people are justifiably are not really worried about the second wave, the third wave, and of course the sixth wave, which is going to be far worse than all of them, right? But once people get over that, yes, you're absolutely right. An 800-seat Airbus chugging people around the world very comfortably and with enormous range. I mean, that's what I don't understand about this Project Sunrise. Qantas was saying, it's still talking about getting A350s flying direct Perth to London. Well, apparently an A380 can already do that with a reasonable load.
Yeah.
So
Air France are grounding their A380 fleet. Talk of Etihad doing the same, Qatar doing the same.
Etihad have said they'll bring theirs back.
Oh,
they've said that, and Clark at Emirates has said they're still going to be flying a lot of A380s for a long time.
Yeah, there was talk that they'd let 40 go, and he came back in, didn't he, and said no way.
Yeah. No, he's always been a huge fan of that plane, and it's obviously made them a lot of money. Yeah. And
they would have bought those, given the scale of the order, at way below list prices. So, way below.
They would have gotten real cheap. Yeah. Boeing are now talking of, or they've gone back to, there's going to be a clean sheet design for the new single aisle or the new middle of the market aircraft. Optimistically, they're saying it should be ready by 2030, which of course is going to cut them out of a lot of sales because Delta wanted to be the launch customer for that. And now people are saying, well, Delta will probably end up buying A330-800 Neos. There's a perfect lower capacity wide body 767 replacement, and use it on dense routes within America, shorten medium to medium, where capacity is not required. And some of the talk is making Airbus seems to be very good at paper certification. So you can have a plane that can fly 6,000 miles, but they'll recertify it so you only put half the fuel in and give it a 4,000 mile range. They're looking at variants of the A330-800 to do exactly that. So you can take 20 tons off the weight, lower your landing fees, and only fly short range. And then towards the end of its life, when it's got a number of cycles on it, you can then change the certification and start flying across the Pacific.
Yeah, and for an airline Delta's size, with that commonality of flight decks across the entire range and the sort of the philosophy of it, man, that must be a lot. It must be a lot cheaper to keep your flight crew trained up.
Yeah.
Rather than all these individual types like Boeing have got.
And I think that's what yes, I mean, Delta does seem to be quite well run, and that's obviously the training, just simply the amount of training they save is probably enormous.
Yeah. I haven't heard about the health of those other American carriers like Spirit and Frontier and Alaska. I guess Alaska's always going to have their little market, special market given where they're centered. But there's been no talk of the future of those airlines. And who was the big US carrier that might go under? Well, there's been no more talk about that either. So
no more talk about that. No. It's kind of, the last week or so it's been a bit, I'd say suspiciously quiet. I mean, the only major news that I've picked up is Air New Zealand firing a lot of their senior executives and being very pessimistic about their loads. Otherwise, it's been mainly the crash, the Boeing announcement, and just more bankruptcies.
Yeah. What about South African Airlines? There was news about SAA sort of nosediving a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago. Well, there's been no more news. Would the South African government always support SAA in the end?
No, it's gone. They're going to open up a new national airline.
Oh, so I missed that. So it's done and dusted.
Pretty much, that's the plan. It's all over.
So it's easier to completely let it go and start again.
Probably is.
Wow.
Yeah. So the SAA is at this stage. It seems to be completely gone. Yeah.
Virgin, I see, have granted all their 747-400s, 7 of them are never to fly again for them, and they've bailed out of Gatwick. I see that Virgin launch system has been in the news the last week or so, the satellite launch system from under wasn't there a TriStar launch system a while back?
Yeah, that was a US company. Yeah, I forget what that was called.
Yeah.
Air launch rockets it's one of those things that seems to be the next big thing, and it never really seems to work. Virgin, they're quite confident, and they're going to do another test real soon. But it separated from the aircraft, but didn't make the transition from horizontal to. But in fact, it didn't really make much of a transition at all. It basically separated from the aircraft and fell into the sea, which is not a good thing.
And as we're talking today, I think just a few hours ago, the SpaceX mission with the astronauts was scrubbed due to, I think, a storm or something. It wasn't technical, it was weather related.
Yeah, 17
so
minutes
he's
before
on
launch.
I mean, he always gets it right. That's going to work. You can just tell.
Yeah, I was watching that, and I'd been up since 4:30 because I got the time wrong. So yeah, I checked in and watched it, and I was watching it 17 minutes before launch. They scrubbed it due to weather. Now they've got another opportunity, I believe, on the 30th.
Okay,
so yeah,
that's a couple of days away.
Yeah, very high chance that you'll get that right. Yeah.
And is that capsule that can take up to 8 people?
4. That particular one's 4.
All right.
But I think they can put a second floor in it and take 8. Yeah.
Trump's been touring around NASA. Watched a bit of that today. He said, last time I was here was a ghost town. Now it's really busy. It's great to see. So I think he was taking credit for that.
Oh, of course he would. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So I'll be watching for that on the 30th. And I mean, he's talking about being on the moon within a couple of years, isn't he?
2024.
Yeah.
And he's building his 7th.
Yeah.
He's building his 7th Starliner prototype. I mean, it's taking him about this is the amazing thing. So he's building those test vehicles for his Starliner system. And incredibly, it takes him about 6 weeks to build a rocket.
Yeah.
And he's built them outside. Okay, none of them have actually flown yet, although one's getting pretty close to flying, or they've done a test hop. So the ones he's building now, he wants to take up to sort of 25 kilometers, downrange a bit, uprange a bit, bring it back, bring it down. That's to test the new motors. But yeah, he reckons he should be able to go suborbital maybe later this year, do an orbit early next year, and then go up to full scale, do a few tests, and then get something into lunar orbit at least by 2024. And he's building them outside, which just flies in the face of everything. I mean, talk about doing it on the cheap.
But that sometimes can be, the sort of the common sense approach. I see that they went back to stainless steel, and also I've seen a few interviews with him. If anything gets too complicated, it sort of annoys him.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely that's we need more of that. I mean, you know Bob Bogash and you know the development of the 747 really, really well. How long did that take? And now how long does it take?
2 years
Boeing, I think they bring 2 years, and now Boeing are looking at a new middle of the market aircraft, and they reckon if they're lucky, it's going to be in the air by 2030. And we know it's not going to be in the air by 2030. And you think 9 years? What's wrong with you people?
Yeah, it's a different sort of and you asked the question, why has it become a sort of retrograde process compared to historical? I mean, they're still complicated engineering problems no matter what era you're talking about. Maybe they had more people working on it back then. There was a different sort of more common sense, practical approach to it. They just got on and did it. There weren't so many middlemen. I wonder what's changed, really.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the new abilities we have in terms of analysis. They will spend 5 years doing wind tunnel models to get that last 0.4% of fuel efficiency out of the design. But you think, at what cost? You've spent 5 years. You could have been selling them for 5 years. And are you really going to get 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, 2%? I don't know that you are. I mean, I think the very fact that some of those old designs have flown on as long as they are, because you got them out there quicker and cheaper and flogged a whole lot more of them, it doesn't really matter that you could save 1% here, 2% there.
I went to
I don't know.
NASA Langley and the wind tunnel where all the 747 wind tunnel testing was done. In fact, they still have one of the models sitting out back there, quite a big model, which I think they'd used it for the areas around where the engine pylons join, because you could see where they'd had different locations where they'd put things for the wind tunnel model. And I mean, it was history right there, but it had a very practical sort of sense. There's no computer stuff there. It was like very physical.
Yeah, and then they spend thousands of man hours or person hours designing the most aerodynamic aircraft they can, and then the operator decides to put satellite TV on it. So they stick like a wheelie bin to the roof of the plane, so they can put the satellite antenna in. Well, okay, yeah, good thing you put in all that work in reducing the drag, because now you're just going to stuck a bloody great aerial on the roof of it.
Yeah, and also it only takes a little change in the price of oil, and all that 0.3% means nothing.
Yeah, so I think it is amazing, and I've read the book about the development of the 747 and subsequent programs. They just took longer and longer and longer, and I think if we can get back to a bit of what SpaceX is doing with building, I don't think you should build the next future airliner outside. That if you can build a rocket outside, literally outside, and that just amazes me every time. There's live feeds from South Padre Island, and you can see them welding bits of steel together and carrying around with cranes and dumping them on top of each other. And a week later, there's a rocket standing there. Jeez, guys, that's amazing. I mean, look at the comparison's difficult, I guess, but you look at Blue Origin and the Amazon team. I mean, they've been apparently building this rocket for 10 years. No one's ever seen it.
Yeah, well, that's the difference. Musk's the sort of person, if he says it, usually reality follows along with him. He creates it. He's sort of kind of quite unique in that sense. And I mean, he even stared down the Californian state government, didn't he, a few weeks ago about relocating Tesla, and he won.
Yes, he won. He did win, and there was all this. There's all these messages going around. Oh, Elon's trying to kill his workers. Blah blah blah.
I saw that.
But he put the letter. He put the letter online. If you don't feel safe coming back to work, don't worry about it. That's fine.
Well, that again is an example of the way media manipulation works. And actually, it's a very good example, because you would think that so-called liberals would be environmentally inclined, and the vehicles that Elon Musk is making takes us away from mass use of transportation, fossil fuel. But that wasn't enough to offset what was perceived to be going against the I mean, I want to find kind words. I don't want to make it sound like everyone's like a brainwashed unit, but all that was thrown away for this petty trying to catch him out on this sort of technical COVID lockdown sort of interpretation. I often wonder if people are actually losing the plot. The bigger picture is he's creating a path forward to get off this mass transportation or mass use of fossil fuel for transportation. Yet that all just goes out the window at the slightest thing. I mean, there does seem to be a level of derangement out there.
Yes, and it's not as if the production line workers are made up of elderly people with underlying conditions. So, most of them are going to be fine.
Yeah, well, there you go. So more strength to him. It must be quite a guy. I'd really like to meet and have a chat with Elon Musk. I think it'd be very interesting. I think he'd probably be a very down-to-earth person.
Or a nightmare.
But hey, either way, it's interesting.
It would be interesting, yeah.
But he doesn't fail at things. Well, not in the big picture. He might fail at the big picture.
No, it's just incredible. I recommend people going to look at the South Padre Island live feeds. There's a couple of them, and it is kind of mind-boggling when it's basically welders and steel fabricators just literally throwing a rocket together on the ground.
Yeah.
No filtered air environment, temperature control. Just get out there and cut metal and stack it up on top of each other.
Literally like doing it in the backyard.
Like building a silo.
Yeah.
And they said, well, that's kind of what it is. It's a big silo
Yeah.
with liquid fuel and a couple of rockets at the bottom.
And maybe if it works there, it'll work anywhere, which is quite a good thing for reliability.
Yeah, it's yeah. Well, I can't say it enough. It's mind blowing. And then for the people who are, I mean, I'm not a Tesla fanboy, although I obviously am to some extent. People should go and watch that Sandy Munro Live series of videos on YouTube. It's, Munro Live, it's called, and it's the guy's name, Sandy Munro. He runs a company that's quite a successful engineering company that dismantles cars and provides in-depth analysis for competition. So Toyota might commission Sandy to go and get the latest 5 Series BMW and take it down to bare metal, strip everything, label it, analyze it, and then tell Toyota what's good about it, what's bad about it, etc., etc. Well, he's been doing the same for Teslas. So he's done the Tesla Model 3 and he's done the Tesla Model Y. And again, it's a little bit like SpaceX. Stuff's just happened that anyone probably could have done, anybody could have done. But in the production of this car, they've just cut through so much and just done it. And Munro is I think he's a pretty hard guy to impress, and he's come away very impressed with a lot of what Tesla have done in that vehicle. There's obviously issues, and he's pretty upfront about those. But again, this shows you if somebody says, let's do it, but let's just do it properly, it happens. And you just wish there was a bit more of that in the aviation industry at the moment.
I've been watching some videos lately of guys sort of doing test drives and once-overs of older English cars like the Morris Marina, the Austin Allegro, the Austin / Morris 1800, the Land Crab, all those things. Gosh, and the Vauxhall Viva, some guy took it out for what a hopeless car. But they are very entertaining. Very entertaining.
Yeah. Yes.
I didn't realize that the Morris Marina was actually just a Maury Thau repackaged.
Well, that makes sense for Leyland because they were deeply cynical by that stage.
They described the Leyland logo, the plug hole to hell or something.
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact term, but it was something like that. But anyway, very entertaining viewing, and considering these were the vehicles of the day when we were younger.
Well, in German, they used to call, because there were a few British Leyland cars around in Germany when I was living there, and it was called British Airland, which means like terrible, British terrible. That's kind of how you pronounce that, British Airland. Yeah. No, yes, and again, that's something that because the car industry, although those old cars are very quaint and the cars of our childhood and all that type of thing, it's no different in terms of cynicism. It's no different today. Like I've got an old Ute that I paid $500 for, whatever, and you could go and buy a brand new Ute for $85,000, right? It's still got a ladder chassis. It's still got cart springs on the back. It's not fundamentally different from mine, which is 14 years old. And how do you get people to pay $85,000 for a pickup truck?
Don't know.
And that's not very good.
Yeah, very good question.
And not significantly different from one that was built 25 years ago. Yeah, there's a couple of computers in it. The engine's a bit fancy and everything. But in terms of capability, it's kind of exactly the same. But that's where the car industry has got to, and that's why they are ripe for change. And I guess that's what Tesla and a few others are doing. But the others, none of them seem to get off the starting blocks. It's the same with these rocket companies. Tesla was going to, you better watch, SpaceX, you better watch out. There's going to be all this competition. Well, none of it's happened. Oh, you got the Rocket Lab. He's doing well and good on it. A different scale, but that's brilliant that he's got off the ground and that's working. So of all these competitors, Blue Origin, there were dozens at one stage. You got 2, and hat off to them. They've done it. But you wonder why more don't do it.
Yeah, the Marina windscreen wipers were the Maury Thau ones, but because of the reshaped bonnet and the way they stuck out is over a certain speed, they'd lift off the windscreen.
They'd lift off the windscreen, yeah. But you remember you could buy those vanes that clipped onto the window on the windscreen wipers.
Is that what they were for?
That's what they would have pushed the windscreen, the wipers back down onto the. I mean, I had an English car when I was living in Germany, and I stripped some of the exhaust bolts, trying to get them off, as can happen. And I went to a local garage to get some thread cutters to chase the threads out, to just fix them up a little bit. And we found out that British Leyland had been going metric. But at this point, all they'd done, they'd metricized the heads of the bolts, but the threads were all their standard old imperial threads. So we ended up having to drill them out completely and putting in metric threads and new bolts. And you just think, who would ever make that decision? The ultimate compromise fail.
Yeah. Well, I think
quite
back then, I think that defined the country, didn't it? That sort of attitude. Hey, in maybe not this podcast, but in future podcasts, we're going to ramp up some of the content. So we remember when we did them years ago, we used to do the airliner of the day or the aircraft of the show. We're going to get back into that next episode, and we can share web pages and stuff. So we'll do that. If anyone has any suggestions on what they'd like to have covered, we can look into a bit. Though I know people can do it easily for themselves, but it's nice to hear people chatting about it. Feel free, just send an email to paulairside@gmail.com. We can do that, and we'd really like some support. We think that there is a good market for this sort of programming in the aviation space globally, even though we're coming out of this part of the world. There are not too many podcasts around that I've seen. Certainly not with the history of ours. We've been going for about 7 or 8 years now.
Yeah, and none with this backdrop, right?
No, well, no one would have ever thought that would. And it's only because you're stranded in Australia.
Literally stranded in Australia. Yeah,
I was talking to a guy who's going back to Australia today, actually, and he has to spend 2 weeks in quarantine on re-entering the country, which is crazy because he's coming from places with no cases.
Wow.
So
that's crazy.
Yeah. Well, you can't let your power and control go too easily. I mean,
Oh, and while we're on, I'd just like to shout out to all the listeners in Myanmar, because I've been looking through our stats, and the podcast gets a few listens in Myanmar.
It's incredible.
So,
let's not say anything negative about Myanmar then.
It would never cross my mind.
I wonder how we do in China.
In fact, in fact, one of the trips I've got at the back of my mind that I want to do eventually is those Myanmar riverboats. There's apparently that's a fantastic trip you can take on these cargo/passenger boats. They run up and down the major river going through Myanmar.
Yeah, that sounds and not a very well traveled part of the world, given that they've been pretty well closed off, haven't they, in our lifetime up till maybe recently. So I'd like to give a shout out to the Bring Our Birds Home associate, personal friend of mine, Cesar Nogueira, sitting there in Sao Paulo. He's been confined to his apartment for a long period of time. They've got big COVID-19 cases through there. I think they're the worst affected country now. Cesar's got some issues that means he's vulnerable, so he's had to stay at home. He's spent a long time there. We hope you're okay there, Cesar. We look forward to getting back out and finishing the process with the DC-8. We had a photo through of that, I think I mentioned last podcast, a week or so, or a couple of weeks ago, still sitting there waiting for us. Hoping to get over to North Carolina, USA, sometime in the not too distant future to really sort out the 737. Just before this all struck, I had a whole lot of sponsorship propositions and pitches all ready to go. One involving obviously Air New Zealand. I think it's probably a better time to talk to them soon once they get up and running a bit more, because I sense that the culture of the management's changed, and I sense that they'll probably put more value on their history, which they should be acknowledging. They wouldn't be where they are today without it. So we'll see what happens there, but a bit of spanner thrown in the works. But I want to reassure everybody who's interested in that project that it's not just a one roll of the dice; it's multiples, and we keep on pushing ahead. But I really hope Cesar is okay with his wife Deborah in their Sao Paulo apartment, and you got to feel for people in that country, in some of those big cities. I know Manaus, where we were, has had some high casualty rate from COVID-19. Again, it's the elderly people, Martin, affected, but their healthcare system is not quite up to what having the capacity to deal with that. But they do tell me that the numbers are dropping there now of their own accord. So maybe that's how the pattern of these things go.
Yeah.
But we'll bring more content into this. And if you want to support us, go to the Patreon address you see on the screen, the Bring Our Birds Home Patreon address. We're using that Patreon account to support both this and Bring Our Birds Home. And like I say, we have our first patron. And they always say, Martin, the first one's the hardest.
There you go.
So let's see how we go. And we want to do this at least once a week. But, if we have the support, we can put more resources to it. It sort of makes sense. So watch out for more content and more regularity as that support ramps up. And it's nice to know that we are being viewed in places like Myanmar. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And Canada.
Yeah,
and Thailand.
I know Australia and US.
No, I think it's 27 countries we have listeners in or viewers in.
Yeah, we get good
That's
comments.
Just for the podcast. So, yeah.
And look at the potential. I mean, not that we're going to get to that, but Joe Rogan's just gone to Spotify for minimum 100 million, it seems.
Good old Joe. Good on him.
Well, he spent a lot of. I've been watching his show for probably about 8 or 9 years since he started, and it's taken him a long time to build it up. But now he gets great guests, great content, and look where that can take you. But I mean, we have a good opportunity in the aviation space, so let's push as hard as we can.
Yeah, and hopefully, COVID will be not worth talking about soon.
Well, hopefully that will recede right away, and the only thing we will be saying is, pity we reacted in the way we did, but we'll never know if that was right or wrong anyway, so we'll probably even drop that. So, all right, so have we got anything else to talk about? I think we're pretty well done for this past week anyway, right?
I'm getting hassled by starlings, so magpies, sorry.
Magpies. You look a bit unsettled there, Martin. It was like some sort of Alfred Hitchcock
I don't know. We'll see what happens. Yes.
All right, so in the meantime,
I've got to go to work.
We're signing off. Paul Brennan here in the bunker in Auckland with my look out for Keropunk. It's going to become big. Steampunk's big. Okay. Keropunk could be just as big. And that's everything that runs on kerosene, of course. So hopefully we'll be back with it. Well, we will be. We'll be back next week. And you are?
Still in Roma and might still be in Roma next week, but we'll see. Here I am, Outback Australia. See you later.
See you later.